So it has been federal taxpayers that have underwritten Australia's COVID response at every level of government in this country. Now, our government doesn't take any issue with that. None whatsoever.
Well, I do take issue with that, Prime Minister, and so does my next guest. You see, every election we hear that the Liberals are the better economic managers, and that may technically be true compared with the socialist snake oil salesman from the Australian Labor Party. But really, saying that the Liberal Party is better on the economy in 2021 is like saying that you prefer Pizza Hut over Domino's. A notional improvement maybe, but really they're both crap. Make no mistake, the Australian economy is a house built on quicksand, and it is sinking into $1 trillion debt. Now, this isn't some dry economic argument. It has real-world consequences. Wages are barely keeping up with inflation. A flood of cheap money is doing wonders for the asset owners, but nothing for ordinary wage earners. And the so-called COVID-induced recession has thrown thousands of Australians onto the dole queue. But GDP is on the way up, so that's a good sign, right? Well, not really, says James Allen in a scorcher of a piece in this weekend's edition of The Spectator Australia. So let's hear what he has to say. Well, joining me now is Professor of Law at the University of Queensland and Spectator Australia regular, the great James Allen. James, how are you, mate?
Fine, thank you, Gideon. Thanks for having me on.
You've written this sensational article basically demolishing the Morrison government over its economic management, something that should be a Liberal claim to fame but is not. You've mentioned specifically the metric of GDP growth and how the government boasting about a 3% rise in GDP really isn't that much to crow about. So for our economic layman watching, what is GDP growth and why is it a misleading indicator of the health of the economy?
So when you look it up, GDP just measures economic activity. Its two main criteria are household spending and government spending. So if the government spends a lot, GDP by definition goes up. It's not, productivity or any of the other things. And so in a way, it's a very Keynesian measure. It's not worthless. And so when I watched Josh Frydenberg, the treasurer, do the sort of sky after dark circuit with everyone going, whoa, GDP went up 3.1%. I thought, well, this is pretty much a worthless measure. So leave aside that on GDP per capita, Australia has not done well. So the last 30 years, everyone goes, GDP's been great. But if you double the population of a tiny country, GDP by definition explodes, but people could be much worse off. And Australia has done no better in per capita terms really than Japan, which has no immigration. So one of the ways we've increased GDP over the last 30 years is just to run the world's biggest Ponzi scheme, mass immigration. We come to COVID, and the problem, it seemed to me, with bragging about how you're doing right now is that you've sort of missed the fact that Josh Frydenberg and Team Morrison are massive spenders. They outspent Justin Trudeau in dealing.
You're joking.
To brag about when Howard and Costello stepped down or gave their last budget, we effectively basically had zero government Commonwealth debt, and I don't know, it was like $220 billion of spending. That's 15 years later. We're talking about now. Got $1 trillion of debt. Most of that time was coalition government, so it's not like it's been all Labor. They don't do anything. And what spending is going to stabilize in a few years at about 600 billion. So they're spending like drunken sailors. Yeah. Or since GDP in large part measures government spending, of course GDP is going up.
What is this influx of cheap money doing to not just economically but socially? And maybe you can touch on also the role in the Reserve Bank of all of this.
Unless you buy into that modern monetary theory mumbo jumbo, inflation has to pop up somewhere, and it's popping up in assets. So basically, I think they're monetizing the debt in a way. And so that's great if you've got a house or two houses, or it'll also show up in the stock market indice. I mean, everything's going up because there's so much more money. And that's great. If you've got stuff, I've got a house, but it's terrible for my kids. It's terrible for hardworking young people.
For all the talk of the left of inequality, there is an issue with inequality. You know, wage earners who earn their money in Australian dollars, for example, will be disadvantaged. Asset speculators who have wealth will be advantaged. Not one person from the left, as far as I'm aware, is saying this reckless what Kevin Rudd, to his credit, once said, which is this reckless spending must stop. But you wrote in your piece that unless you believe government spending drives innovation and productivity, we're trending in a really bad direction. The problem is people do actually believe that.
They do tend to believe it, but there's no evidence for it. If you look at the countries where government spending is 50% plus of GDP, so we're talking about Greece and Italy, and I guess sub-sovereign level Scotland, they don't have very good outcomes. They have no productivity it's like and we're I don't know what, I just read this, so I'm open to being corrected, but I think we're trending towards a peacetime record of Commonwealth state government spending trending towards 40% of GDP. That is terrible.
I think we need to face facts here that the Liberals have culturally and institutionally been too high spenders. But look, just on that, I'll ask you without notice.
Let me just say something to that, Gideon. I mean, the counter argument, the only one I find plausible is if you're a Stephen Harper like Prime Minister in Canada and you make an effort to cut spending, you know going in that sooner or later you're going to lose.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is the left-wing party is going to come in and explode the spending. So there is a school of argument that says, look, why don't we spend on our priorities?
Yeah.
And that, because there's no way to stop the left from coming in and blowing out the spending. Now, if you find that plausible, then at least you should be aiming for taxing cuts, because they're harder to turn around.
Yeah.
I mean, blowing out the spending the way this coalition government doesn't even serve the argument of, well, sooner or later Labor's going to get in and blow it. So make it hard for them. Cut taxes, which is a form of spending, of course, because you're not being able to meet your debt obligations. Do something that actually makes it difficult. I mean, Harper reduced the GST. That's the only example in the democratic world. And that's very hard to turn around. Even Trudeau's finding that hard.
Well, we may as well spend because otherwise Labor will run on it and come in and spend anyway. Well, what the hell is the damn difference? What will we be in a $2 trillion debt instead of a $1 trillion debt? I mean, it's monopoly money at this stage. It's totally meaningless.
I mean, one of the things that really irks me about this coalition government, and they are a massive disappointment. I mean, I still think it might have been better for Shorten to win the 2016 election and let them do all this. At least we'd have a coalition that stood for something. You can't put your finger on anything they've really done. But there's two main elements. There's the economic element, which is incredibly disappointing. But even more disappointing is the complete lack of concern about all freedom-related issues in this. If they were big spenders, but they were actually doing something about the inroads into basic civil liberties, you might be able to swallow it a bit better. But they don't do that either. You can see a prime minister who says freedom's a third order issue, and then he doesn't make a comment about Pell. He doesn't make a comment about the total lack of procedural fairness in how Dyson Hayden was treated, or Christine Holgate, or the SAS officers.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, and then you see that when this horrible attack on Porter comes, well, it's not like they did anything for anyone else. And so part of you says, well, it's ridiculous to try to respond to 30-year-old allegations in any system committed to procedural fairness. But on the other hand, you think, well, they never stand up for anybody. Just remember that Porter didn't say a word about the hatchet job on Dyson Hayden. I don't know whether he did it or didn't do it, but the way the procedures that were used were shocking. And the same goes for what's happening right now with the SAS. Who goes and apologizes to other countries before you've had a proper procedure?
Now, you wrote that it is wrong to call this a COVID-induced recession. And I agree, this is a government-induced recession. So can you talk us through a little bit more about how you reached that conclusion?
Basically, when you look at comparisons of countries that have locked down and countries that haven't, there is actually no statistical evidence at all that lockdowns work. So if you compare Florida, which basically hardly locked down at all, to New York, they have half the deaths per million. If you compare us to Taiwan was much more attuned to they've done better than we have.
Yeah.
Look at Sweden, it comes in about 24th in Europe, in the countries, and Sweden didn't lock down at all. So did it do worse than we did? Yes. But it's a Northern Hemisphere country with really cold climate. It did better than Britain, which has one of the strictest lockdowns.
Yep.
And so if you run through some of the problems, it seems that lockdowns, there's no evidence they work. It's pretty clear that politicians love power. The so-called health experts who are advising them and they delegate it completely to, many of them are pretty mediocrely credentialed people. And if one thing we know from this whole COVID saga, it's that claims to expertise look pretty threadbare.
Yeah. Well,
The so-called experts have basically screwed up. Niall Ferguson, who did the modeling, he hasn't gotten anything right in his whole professional life. Got BSE wrong. He got foot and mouth wrong. His claims that what would happen in this COVID lockdown, if you didn't lock down, have been wrong by a couple orders of magnitude.
And as a parallel, you see the official experts, warnings on climate change. None of them have ever eventuated or come to fruition. And every time there's a mistake, the modelling is now telling us this. The emperor has no clothes on this stuff, and it's absolutely showing. But anyway, Jim, I could go on for another 3 hours with you, but unfortunately we do have to go. But thank you for coming on. Excellent.
My
article.
pleasure. You guys are doing God's work, and the Spectator's great. I hope we can get more and more people to subscribe because it's one of the sane outlets in this country.
From your mouth to God's ears, Jim.